There is a quiet exhaustion that grows inside a sensitive soul who spends too long trying to make everyone comfortable. It begins softly, like a whisper beneath the surface, a small tightening in the chest every time one's own truth is silenced, a subtle ache when peace is maintained at the cost of authenticity. The sensitive person believes that harmony is safety, that by agreeing, by nodding, by softening their edges, they will be loved, accepted, and protected. Yet over time, this constant agreement becomes a silent prison, one that traps the spirit inside patterns of compliance disguised as kindness. To be sensitive is to feel deeply, not only one's own emotions, but also the unspoken feelings of others. The sensitive soul notices tension in the air before words are spoken, hears disappointment in the tone before it becomes visible, and senses anger even when it hides behind a smile. Because of this awareness, such a soul often chooses to bend rather than break the peace. They agree to what is untrue, they smile when they want to retreat, they forgive before they have healed. This behavior, repeated again and again, becomes an emotional reflex to avoid confrontation, to absorb discomfort, to carry what is not theirs. The weight of constant agreement grows slowly, unnoticed. It accumulates in moments that seem small. When someone interrupts and the sensitive one lets them continue rather than speaking up, when they say yes to an invitation though their body longs for solitude, when they offer understanding to someone who never seeks to understand them in return. These moments, individually harmless, together become a heavy chain around the heart. Each unspoken truth is like a stone added to an invisible bag they carry everywhere. Eventually, the sensitive soul begins to feel distant from themselves. They can sense the emotions of others but lose sight of their own. They become skilled at predicting reactions, avoiding disapproval, maintaining calm. Yet they forget how to express their own inner weather. They mistake the absence of conflict for peace, when in truth it is only suppression. The body begins to speak what the mouth cannot. Fatigue settles in. Anxiety grows from unexpressed words. The spirit feels hollow, not because life is cruel, but because it has been lived according to other people's comfort. The world often praises the agreeable. Society calls them kind, cooperative, selfless. But there is a hidden sorrow behind such praise. When the sensitive person constantly agrees, they are rewarded with temporary harmony, but deprived of inner freedom. Their compassion becomes currency, their peace is purchased through self-denial. They learn that to keep love, they must silence themselves. This belief burrows deep into the subconscious, shaping relationships where the sensitive one becomes the caretaker of everyone else's emotions, leaving their own neglected. The soul, however, is patient, but not passive. It endures for years, quietly observing the imbalance. Yet there comes a day when something inside begins to question. Why do I always say yes when my heart says no? This question marks the beginning of awakening. The weight becomes too heavy to carry unnoticed. The sensitive soul starts to feel an inner resistance, a quiet revolt. It is not anger at others, but a realization that self-betrayal has become a habit. This realization is both painful and liberating. Painful because it reveals how much of one's life has been shaped by fear of disapproval. Liberating because awareness itself begins to dissolve the chains. The sensitive soul starts to see that agreement without alignment is not kindness, but exhaustion in disguise. That empathy, when it excludes oneself, turns into self-abandonment. That peace, if maintained through silence, is not peace, but repression wearing a gentle face. The process of shedding this weight is not dramatic. It happens in small, quiet acts of courage. The first time they speak up, their voice trembles, but it is real. The first time they say no, guilt rises, but so does power. The first time they disappoint someone by honoring their truth, they feel both fear and relief. Slowly, the muscles of self-respect begin to strengthen. The soul starts to remember its original shape. The form it had before approval became its compass. And yet, the sensitive one must face an uncomfortable truth. People accustomed to their agreement may not easily accept their authenticity. When they stop nodding to every demand, when they stop agreeing for the sake of peace, some will withdraw, some will resist. This is the natural reaction of a world that benefits from compliance. The sensitive soul must learn to withstand this tension, to allow discomfort to exist without immediately soothing it. In this discomfort lies growth. The weight of constant agreement begins to lift only when the sensitive one realizes that disagreement is not destruction. Conflict, when honest, can be a doorway to deeper connection. Saying no can be an act of love for oneself and for others. True harmony does not come from pretending but from presence. The heart that once sought safety in approval learns to find peace in authenticity. There is a lightness that returns when a person no longer carries the burden of pleasing everyone. It is the weightless feeling of being aligned with truth rather than expectation. The sensitive soul begins to see that their empathy is a gift, not a duty, that their compassion has value, but not at the expense of their boundaries. They learn that real kindness does not require them to shrink. It allows them to meet the world with openness while remaining anchored within. Every time they choose truth over comfort, the invisible stones fall away. Every time they honor their feelings without apology, their spirit becomes lighter. And slowly, they begin to walk differently, not burdened by the constant need to agree, but carried by the quiet strength of being whole. There comes a subtle shift, almost imperceptible at first, in the life of a sensitive soul who has long been immersed in the currents of pleasing others. It is not heralded by fanfare or dramatic events, but arrives quietly, as a gentle stirring in the chest, a soft whisper in the mind, a weight on the shoulders that suddenly feels unbearable. The sensitive soul has spent years navigating the emotions of others, measuring every word, anticipating every reaction, and smoothing every rough edge, often at the expense of their own truth. And yet one day, without warning, there is a recognition, a dawning awareness that life has been lived as a reflection of everyone else's expectations rather than a mirror of their own heart. The moment of awakening is not always accompanied by clarity. At first, it manifests as discomfort, a restlessness that cannot be ignored. The soul may feel an unusual irritation at the routines that once brought comfort, a sudden unease at familiar patterns of agreement, a small but insistent questioning of old habits. Why do I do this? The mind asks. Why do I continually diminish myself to preserve harmony? It is a question that lingers, echoing through thoughts and feelings, growing louder until it cannot be silenced. In this awakening, the sensitive one begins to notice what was previously invisible, the small betrayals to themselves, the subtle sacrifices made for others' approval, the quiet erosion of their own desires beneath the weight of expectation. It is important to understand that this awakening is not a sudden rebellion. It is not an act of defiance born of anger or frustration, but the gentle recognition of misalignment. It begins in introspection, in the willingness to feel discomfort rather than mask it, in noticing the tension between the soul's truth and the roles it has performed. The sensitive one begins to feel the difference between living authentically and performing compliance, between connection rooted in presence and relationships sustained through habitual accommodation. It is here, in the contrast, that awakening takes root, growing quietly in the soil of self-awareness. The awakening often brings with it a wave of emotions that may seem overwhelming at first. There is sadness for the years spent sacrificing self, for the moments of silent suffering endured to avoid displeasing others. There is guilt for the ways in which they may have neglected their own needs while attending to everyone else's. There is fear too, the fear of change, the fear of rejection, the fear of disrupting the carefully maintained equilibrium. And yet beneath all these layers of emotion, there is also a sense of relief, subtle but profound. The soul begins to realize that it has been carrying a burden that need not be permanent, that the freedom to live authentically is not only possible, but necessary for their own well-being. This awakening changes perception in subtle ways. The sensitive soul begins to see patterns that were previously invisible. They recognize the relationships where energy flows only one way, where effort is unreciprocated, where approval is demanded but authenticity is rejected. They notice the small compromises that have accumulated into weight, the habitual silences that have muted their own voice, the endless seeking of validation that has left the soul feeling empty. Each recognition is like a crack in a long-standing armor, allowing light to filter through, illuminating what was hidden by the desire to please. Awareness comes choice. For the first time, the sensitive soul recognizes that they are not powerless in the face of expectation. They see that saying no does not dissolve love, that speaking truth does not destroy connection, that prioritizing self does not equate to selfishness. The awakening carries with it a subtle courage, a willingness to face discomfort, a readiness to redefine relationships and reclaim boundaries. This courage is quiet at first, a whisper rather than a roar, but it is steady, persistent, and transformative. The moment of awakening also brings a recalibration of energy. Where once attention was scattered, divided between the emotions of others and the unspoken desires of self, there is now focus. The sensitive soul begins to reclaim the energy spent on approval, redirecting it inward to nourish self-awareness, self-compassion, and self-expression. Activities that once felt obligatory are now chosen intentionally. Connections that were maintained from habit are reconsidered with discernment. Time and space are no longer gifts given away without thought, but sacred resources to be stewarded with care. In this phase, the sensitive one may encounter resistance, not only from the outside world, but from within. Old habits do not dissolve instantly. The mind protests the loss of familiar patterns, the ego fears disapproval, and the heart may struggle to adjust to a new sense of freedom. But even in this resistance, there is growth. The soul learns to sit with discomfort without dissolving into it, to witness the pull of old expectations without succumbing, to honor their own truth even when it disrupts what has been comfortable. This learning is not instantaneous. It unfolds gradually, with patience, with self-compassion, with the understanding that awakening is a process rather than a destination. The awakening transforms not only the internal landscape, but also the external one. Relationships shift, sometimes subtly, sometimes profoundly. Some connections deepen, nourished by authenticity and mutual respect. Others drift away, revealing their foundation of dependency or expectation rather than genuine alignment. The sensitive soul begins to interact with the world from a place of clarity rather than obligation, from presence rather than performance, from truth rather than fear. And within this transformation, there is a new rhythm of life, one that honors the soul's needs, instincts, and boundaries. The sensitive one begins to move with awareness rather than reaction, to listen to inner guidance rather than external pressure, to act from alignment rather than appeasement. Each step of this journey is both small and monumental, each choice a testament to the power of awareness, each breath a reminder that the soul's awakening is not an event, but a continuous unfolding. For the sensitive soul, who has long existed in the delicate balance of pleasing others, the birth of boundaries is not sudden. It is a quiet unfolding, like the gentle unfurling of a leaf in spring, slow yet inevitable. There comes a time when the soul begins to notice the subtle weight of compromise, the strain of saying yes when the heart whispers no, the exhaustion of bending endlessly to meet the expectations of those around it. The sensitive one realizes that in the act of constant giving, of molding oneself to the comfort of others, a vital part of their essence has been neglected. It is in this recognition that boundaries are born, not as walls to isolate or punish, but as lines of respect drawn gently to honor the self. The birth of boundaries begins with awareness. The sensitive soul first notices the tension between their desires and the demands placed upon them. They feel the pull of obligations that do not align with their inner truth, the subtle discomfort of relationships where energy flows only one way, and the quiet depletion that comes from prioritizing everyone else's needs above their own. In these moments, the soul awakens to the truth that living without boundaries is not kindness, but self-erasure. There is no external event that forces this realization. It arises internally, from a growing understanding that care for others must coexist with care for self. Boundaries at their core are declarations of value. They are statements that say, my feelings matter, my needs matter, my presence is worthy of respect. For the sensitive soul, who has often measured worth through the approval of others, this is a radical shift. To set a boundary is to trust oneself enough to honor discomfort rather than avoid it, to speak truth rather than comply, to choose alignment over acceptance. It requires courage, for the world may react with surprise or resistance. Those accustomed to the sensitive one's acquiescence may push back, unaware that love or loyalty cannot exist in the absence of respect. Yet the soul knows that these moments of tension are necessary, a test of authenticity and a proving ground for integrity. The process of establishing boundaries is gradual, beginning with small, deliberate acts. Perhaps it is the decision to say no to a request that feels draining, or to decline participation in a conversation that undermines peace. It may be the choice to leave a gathering early to honor the need for rest, or to withhold energy from someone whose presence consistently depletes rather than nourishes. These seemingly minor decisions are monumental for the sensitive soul, for each one is an assertion of self-worth and a reclaiming of personal space. With every act, confidence grows, and the internal voice, once drowned by the chorus of others' expectations, becomes clearer and more insistent. Boundaries are not rigid or punitive. They are flexible and compassionate. They do not seek to control or manipulate, but to preserve the natural flow of energy and the integrity of relationships. For the sensitive one, the challenge is to distinguish between protection and isolation. True boundaries allow connection, foster trust, and encourage mutual respect. They do not cut off love, but rather cultivate a version of it that is sustainable and reciprocal. The sensitive soul learns that when energy is respected, when space is honored, and when limits are maintained, relationships deepen rather than diminish. The birth of boundaries also brings with it a heightened sense of clarity. The sensitive soul begins to see who and what aligns with their values and who or what drains them. They learn to recognize patterns of behavior that are unhealthy, to notice when giving becomes self-sacrifice, and to identify moments when intervention is necessary to protect their well-being. This clarity is not harsh judgment, but gentle discernment. It is the ability to observe the world with empathy while maintaining internal integrity, to engage fully without losing oneself in the process. At first, setting boundaries can provoke discomfort, internally and externally. The sensitive soul may feel guilt, fear, or hesitation, questioning whether they are being selfish or unkind. Externally, friends, family, or colleagues may react with confusion, disappointment, or even resentment. But each act of boundary setting strengthens the soul, teaching that discomfort is not always a signal of wrongdoing, but often a sign of necessary growth. The initial resistance, whether internal or external, gradually gives way to a sense of freedom and empowerment, a realization that authenticity is far more sustaining than approval. Boundaries also redefine the flow of energy within the sensitive soul's life. Where energy was once scattered, fragmented by the demands of others, it begins to coalesce. Time, attention, and emotional investment are no longer endless resources to be depleted in service of external expectations. They are conscious choices directed toward what nourishes and supports growth. This recalibration brings a profound sense of peace as the soul experiences the liberation that comes from honoring its limits, choosing alignment over appeasement, and protecting the sanctity of inner life. In this unfolding, the sensitive soul discovers that boundaries are acts of love not only for themselves but for those around them. By establishing limits, they teach others how to treat them with respect, invite authenticity into relationships, and model the possibility of living fully without compromise. Boundaries transform interactions, shifting them from transactional exchanges into intentional connections. They create space for genuine intimacy, for engagement rooted in presence rather than obligation, and for communication that is honest and nourishing. The birth of boundaries is both subtle and profound. It begins in awareness, grows through small acts of courage, and solidifies in the recognition that self-respect is inseparable from compassion. It is a continuous practice rather than a destination, a journey of reclaiming personal power, nurturing authenticity, and cultivating relationships that honor the soul. In establishing boundaries, the sensitive one learns to navigate the world with clarity, strength, and tenderness, discovering that protection of the self is not separation, but a deeper form of engagement. There is a subtle tension that arises when a sensitive soul steps into the realm of authenticity, a tension that is at once unsettling and transformative. For those who have long shaped themselves to meet the expectations of others, who have softened their edges to preserve harmony, or who have hidden their truth to avoid conflict, embracing authenticity is not comfortable. It is not a gentle path, it is a confrontation with the self, with patterns that have long gone unnoticed, with truths that were once too fragile to face. And yet, within this discomfort lies a profound awakening, a gateway into the fullness of life that only honesty can reveal. Authenticity requires vulnerability, and vulnerability carries weight. The sensitive soul, accustomed to reading the moods of others and adjusting to their needs, suddenly finds themselves exposed. Words that were once withheld are now spoken. Thoughts that were once silenced are now expressed. Preferences, desires, and boundaries are no longer hidden beneath a mask of compliance. This exposure, while liberating, is inherently uncomfortable because it disrupts the familiar rhythms of life. To live authentically is to risk disapproval, to invite misunderstanding, to challenge ingrained habits of expectation. And yet, the soul knows that true peace cannot be found in avoidance, that joy cannot flourish in the soil of pretense, and that growth cannot occur without the courage to stand in one's truth. The discomfort of authenticity manifests in multiple forms. It may be internal first, a restless mind, a racing heart, a feeling of disorientation as the familiar patterns of approval and agreement lose their hold. The sensitive soul begins to notice the tension between who they are and who they have been pretending to be. It may feel like guilt for choosing self over others, or fear of the unknown consequences of honesty. There may be moments of doubt, whispers of insecurity questioning whether the path of authenticity is worth the potential cost. These internal struggles are not flaws but signs that the soul is awakening, that the layers of adaptation and habit are beginning to peel away, revealing a deeper, truer self beneath. Externally, authenticity often invites friction. When the sensitive soul speaks their truth, sets boundaries, or refuses to compromise their values for the sake of comfort, others may react with confusion, resistance, or even hostility. Those accustomed to predictability, compliance, and agreement may feel unsettled by the sudden presence of honesty. Friends, family, or colleagues may test limits, challenge decisions, or question motives. The sensitive soul, however, begins to see that this discomfort is not a signal to retreat but an opportunity to maintain integrity. Authenticity, by its very nature, disrupts the comfort of expectation, and disruption, though uncomfortable, is necessary for genuine connection and alignment. The journey of authenticity is also marked by self-discovery. As the sensitive one confronts the tension between their truth and the world, they begin to uncover layers of self that were previously dormant. Hidden desires, forgotten passions, suppressed emotions, and unspoken opinions emerge slowly, demanding recognition. This process can be disorienting as the soul grapples with the enormity of truths that were long ignored. Yet, in facing these truths, the sensitive soul learns resilience, the ability to tolerate discomfort without abandoning integrity, the courage to maintain presence even in uncertainty, and the wisdom to discern when compromise is alignment and when it is self-betrayal. One of the most profound aspects of this discomfort is its invitation to refine relationships. Authenticity reveals who resonates with truth and who cannot accept it. It illuminates connections based on genuine understanding versus those sustained by convenience or expectation. The sensitive soul may experience loss or distance, not as punishment, but as necessary recalibration. Through this process, they learn that real intimacy is not built on constant agreement, but on mutual respect and authenticity. Discomfort, in this sense, becomes a teacher, guiding the soul toward relationships that honor both giving and receiving, both openness and boundaries. The sensitive soul also learns that authenticity is not a static state, but a continuous practice. Each day brings new situations, new interactions, new internal conflicts that require alignment with one's truth. The discomfort does not vanish, it evolves, appearing in different forms as life unfolds. Yet, over time, the sensitive one discovers a subtle shift. The discomfort, though still present, becomes more tolerable, less paralyzing, and more affirming. They begin to recognize that the initial unease is the sound of growth, the pulse of life being reclaimed, the whisper of the soul demanding recognition. Within this tension, there is a quiet liberation. The sensitive soul begins to feel the freedom of living without masks, the relief of speaking without fear, the lightness of presence unburdened by pretense. Choices become clearer, energy more available, and attention more focused. Life gains depth, richness, and clarity, not because the world has changed, but because the soul has aligned with its own inner compass. Authenticity, though uncomfortable, generates a power that is subtle yet profound, a strength rooted not in control over others, but in mastery over the self. The discomfort of authenticity is ultimately a sacred invitation. It calls the sensitive soul to recognize that truth is never painless, that growth is inseparable from unease, and that alignment with self is both demanding and rewarding. It teaches that love, compassion, and connection are not forfeited when honesty is embraced, but rather deepened when it is practiced with care. It shows that boundaries, self-respect, and integrity are not constraints, but the architecture of a meaningful life. And in this unfolding, the sensitive one comes to understand that discomfort is not the enemy but a guide, a constant companion on the journey toward wholeness, presence, And the luminous clarity of being fully oneself, energy, is the subtle currency of life, the invisible force that moves through the body, mind, and soul, shaping the quality of every experience. For a sensitive soul who has long existed in the pattern of pleasing others, energy is often scattered, diffused, and depleted. It is spent on maintaining appearances, moderating reactions, soothing discomfort, and ensuring that the emotional landscape of those around them remains calm. Every act of compliance, every word spoken to avoid conflict, every effort to gain approval consumes a portion of this vital force. Over time, the soul begins to feel tired, restless, and hollow, as though life itself has become a series of borrowed moments drained of the vibrancy that comes from living in alignment with one's true nature. The transformation of energy begins with awareness. The sensitive soul notices the subtle exhaustion that accompanies constant accommodation, the quiet drain of aligning oneself to others' expectations rather than one's own inner truth. There is a recognition that energy has been spent externally, given away as a currency of approval, as a balm to soothe others, as a bridge over turbulent waters that did not belong to them. And yet this awareness is not merely diagnostic, it carries the potential for profound change. The moment the soul begins to redirect attention inward, to reclaim energy that was once dispersed, the transformation begins. Reclaiming energy is not about withdrawal from the world, but about conscious allocation. The sensitive soul starts to discern where energy is needed and where it has been wasted. They notice relationships and interactions that are draining rather than nourishing, commitments undertaken out of habit rather than intention, emotions absorbed from others without reciprocity. In recognizing these patterns, the soul begins to set boundaries, not as a form of separation, but as a way to steward the force of life in a way that honors both self and others. The redirection of energy is gentle yet deliberate, a process of learning to move from reactive giving to intentional sharing. As energy is reclaimed, the sensitive soul experiences subtle shifts in perception and presence. There is clarity where there was confusion, focus where there was diffusion, and a sense of alignment that had long been absent. The mind becomes less burdened by the weight of others' expectations, the heart less entangled in the need for validation, and the body less tense from the unconscious effort to maintain peace. Energy that once flowed outward to manage the emotional landscape of the world now flows inward, nourishing self-awareness, self-expression, and inner growth. This internal nourishment begins to ripple outward, not as effortful giving, but as natural presence and authentic engagement. The transformation of energy is also transformative in its effect on emotions. The sensitive soul learns to distinguish between their own feelings and the feelings absorbed from others. Emotions that were once confusing, overwhelming, or misattributed begin to make sense as the energy of attention is redirected from external approval to internal clarity. Anxiety lessens, not because the world has changed, but because the soul no longer carries the unspoken burdens of others as if they were their own. Joy, once muted by the compulsion to accommodate, begins to surface in its raw, unfiltered form. Peace, long sought externally, becomes an internal reality, grounded not in compliance but in alignment. This transformation also manifests in the way the sensitive soul interacts with others. Relationships shift naturally as energy is no longer expended in the service of expectation. Connections become reciprocal rather than one-sided. Conversations become more authentic rather than performative, and presence becomes more profound. People respond differently when they encounter someone who operates from internal clarity and unfragmented energy. There is an authenticity that invites genuine connection, a calm that stabilizes rather than agitates, a resonance that draws others without effort. The sensitive soul begins to see that energy spent on self-alignment is never wasted, for it magnifies the quality of every engagement. Physical awareness deepens as energy is transformed. The body, which may have carried tension, fatigue, or psychosomatic discomfort from years of external expenditure, begins to release what is no longer needed. Breath becomes more natural, posture more relaxed, and movements more deliberate. Energy once trapped in tension and anxiety now flows freely, allowing the sensitive soul to inhabit the body fully, to act with intention rather than reaction, to experience life with a sense of grounded presence. The connection between mind, heart, and body strengthens as the subtle flow of life force is recognized and nurtured rather than scattered and expended. The sensitive soul also discovers the creative power inherent in transformed energy. Where once effort was consumed in the service of others, it now becomes available for creation, exploration, and self-expression. Thoughts have clarity, intuition sharpens, and inspiration becomes accessible. Energy that was previously dispersed on constant monitoring of external landscapes now fuels inner landscapes, allowing the soul to imagine, to dream, and to act with purpose. The transformation is not merely practical, it is spiritual, emotional, and creative, awakening the latent potential that had been buried beneath the weight of accommodation. There is a profound subtlety in this transformation. It does not happen all at once. Energy flows gradually, sometimes in surges, sometimes in quiet streams, always in alignment with the unfolding awareness of the sensitive soul. The process requires patience, observation, and self-compassion. It asks that the soul notice where energy leaks occur, that it make conscious choices about how it is directed, and that it tolerate the discomfort of recalibration. Resistance may arise, old habits may pull, and patterns of self-sacrifice may reemerge. Yet each conscious redirection, each small reclaiming of force, strengthens the soul's sense of autonomy, clarity, and vitality. Ultimately, the transformation of energy is not merely a change in behavior, it is a metamorphosis of being. The sensitive soul begins to move through the world with a presence that is whole, grounded, and luminous. Energy that was once fragmented, scattered, and spent on maintaining external equilibrium is now focused, vibrant, and aligned with purpose. Life becomes less about survival through compliance and more about thriving in alignment. And in this alignment, the sensitive soul discovers that energy is not finite, but abundant. A force that, when nurtured and directed consciously, becomes the wellspring of clarity, creativity, and profound peace. For the sensitive soul who has long lived in the currents of pleasing others, the return to inner freedom is not a sudden event, but a gradual unfolding, a quiet reawakening that begins the moment self-truth is prioritized over external expectation. It starts with small realizations, moments when the soul notices the weight of habitual compliance, the subtle exhaustion of endless accommodation, the quiet erosion of self in the service of others. These realizations ripple through the mind and heart, awakening a longing for freedom, a desire to live unencumbered by the chains of obligation, approval, and pretense. Inner freedom, for the sensitive one, is the reclamation of presence, authenticity, and energy, a return to the original state of the soul before it became diffused in the demands of the world. The first step toward this freedom is awareness. The sensitive soul begins to recognize the ways in which life has been shaped by external pressures rather than internal guidance. They notice how many choices were made to satisfy, soothe, or appease others rather than align with personal truth. They feel the cost of this pattern in their body, in subtle tension, fatigue, or restlessness, and in their mind, in the persistent anxiety of seeking validation. Awareness is both the spark and the compass of freedom, illuminating the paths that have been lived in shadows and revealing the distance between authentic desire and habitual conformity. As awareness deepens, the soul begins to reclaim its energy. Time, attention, and emotional investment that were once scattered to maintain external harmony are redirected inward. This energy, once depleted in service of compliance, now becomes available for self-nurturing self-expression and the cultivation of inner clarity. The sensitive one begins to see that their own needs are not selfish, that honoring internal boundaries strengthens rather than diminishes connection, and that true presence in relationships comes from authenticity, not performance. Energy flows more freely, and the body, mind, and spirit respond with subtle relief. Tension dissolves, thoughts clarify, and emotions find their natural rhythm. The journey toward inner freedom also involves the conscious setting of boundaries. Boundaries are not walls, but gates that protect the integrity of the soul. The sensitive soul learns to distinguish between what deserves attention and what does not, between responsibilities that align with values and obligations that drain life force. Saying no becomes a declaration of self-respect rather than rebellion. Choosing solitude over obligation is not isolation but replenishment. Boundaries create space for the soul to breathe, to reflect, and to act intentionally, unencumbered by the weight of constant accommodation. In this space, freedom begins to manifest as clarity, presence, and a profound sense of alignment. The return to inner freedom is not without discomfort. As the sensitive soul realigns with self-truth, relationships may shift. Those accustomed to predictability, constant agreement, or energy without reciprocity may resist the change. There may be feelings of guilt, fear, or uncertainty as familiar patterns dissolve. Yet, it is precisely within this discomfort that growth occurs. Freedom is not merely the absence of constraint, but the courage to navigate tension with integrity, the capacity to remain present in the face of resistance, and the wisdom to distinguish between temporary discomfort and misalignment. As the soul continues to reclaim its autonomy, a subtle transformation unfolds internally. The mind grows quieter, no longer preoccupied with anticipating judgment or seeking approval. The heart softens, no longer burdened by the responsibility of soothing others at the cost of self. The body relaxes, shedding tension accumulated from years of unconscious effort to maintain harmony. In this state, the sensitive one experiences a form of liberation that is not dramatic or externally visible but profoundly felt, a gentle, steady, and enduring lightness that permeates every aspect of life. Freedom also deepens the relationship with time. The sensitive soul begins to recognize that time is a precious resource, not to be spent merely in reaction to external demands, but to be allocated with intention. Moments once lost to the anxiety of pleasing, the need to explain, or the compulsion to comply are now invested in contemplation, creativity, and meaningful engagement. Life slows not because the world changes, but because the soul moves with presence rather than habit, acting in alignment with inner truth rather than responding reflexively to expectation. In this rhythm, freedom becomes not a destination, but a lived experience, a continuous practice of conscious choice and intentional living. The return to inner freedom also reshapes how the sensitive soul experiences relationships. Connections deepen when interactions are based on authenticity rather than performance. People are met not with compliance but with presence, not with habitual agreement but with integrity. Freedom fosters clarity in the assessment of relationships, revealing which are nourishing and which are draining, which support growth and which perpetuate compromise. In this space, the soul learns that freedom does not repel connection. Rather, it attracts relationships that resonate with truth and mutual respect, relationships that thrive not on obligation but on authenticity. There is also an emotional liberation in this process. The sensitive soul, once entangled in the emotional currents of others, begins to feel the difference between borrowed feelings and self-experienced emotions. Anxiety diminishes, clarity increases, and the heart begins to pulse in its natural rhythm. Freedom allows the soul to experience life more fully, with feelings that are authentic and aligned rather than reactive or habitual. Joy, gratitude, and even sorrow are experienced deeply and personally without the distortions of compulsion or pretense. Ultimately, the return to inner freedom is a reclamation of selfhood. It is the realization that the sensitive soul is not required to carry the weight of the world, that life is richer when energy is aligned with truth, that presence is more valuable than approval. Freedom emerges as a quiet but profound force, a current that flows through the body, mind, and spirit, transforming the experience of existence into one of clarity, alignment, and conscious participation. The sensitive one begins to live with intention, to honor self without apology, and to engage with the world from a place of integrity, presence, and luminous awareness,